Well, thanks, James, and thanks, Bianca, and thank you, Cuscal, for having me here today. I don't think anyone ever can get used to the concept of giving a speech in front of a live audience, but electronically. So I'll do my best today to stay as active as I can without any audience feedback. As James said, my name's Alastair MacGibbon. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at a company called CyberCX, and as he also said, I have spent various lengths of time in both policing, intelligence agencies and the public sector more broadly. Sadly, I'm a one-trick pony. For the last 20 or so years, I've just dealt with cybersecurity and cybercrime. And sadly, there's never been a better time to be involved in trying to deal with cybercrime because, as James said, it's an industry that has grown quite significantly over the last 20 years. My topic that I was given by Cuscal, which at first I thought seemed a little bit odd, but when I thought about it is perfectly logical, is how we make cybersecurity about humans in the fight against increasingly sophisticated cybercrime. So let me give you a phrase that you may have heard before, the concept of old wine in new bottles. I've spent the last 20 or so years trying to explain to executives, board members, government, and frankly anyone that would listen, that many of the crimes, in fact, I'm going to hazard a guess, all of the crimes that we see occurring online today are old crimes in new bottles. And because of that, we can come to the conclusion that this is a human problem rather than a technology problem. It's a human problem that is facilitated by technology. And while technology is part of the solution to the problem, humans are the ones that need to direct it. This is a human question and it needs human solutions. If I was to look at the industry that I'm part of, one of the great failings of it, one of the reasons why we still see cybersecurity failures at the pace that we see them and with the consequences that are increasing, I posit that one of the reasons is because cybersecurity discussion has been held only by cybersecurity practitioners. If this was any other human problem, climate change, youth unemployment, general crime, all of us would think we had a role to play in a discussion, even if we had no great expertise in it. And so I argue that the same needs to occur when it comes to cybercrime and cybersecurity. My hope today, through this discussion, and please do make it interactive, as James said, it can be pretty lonely sitting here with a camera and some lights talking into the internet. And James does it every day, of course, on radio and would be used to it. Please do send in questions and comments, observations or criticisms. It's important that we engage in this debate. So my hope today is that by the end of this short discussion, and I'm going to talk for only about another 20 or so minutes, and then James and I are going to have about 20 minutes of Q&A, is that you will feel empowered to contribute to a discussion on cybercrime and cybersecurity. If I can achieve that, even with a handful of you, then I've continued my mission. And the reason why I'm so impassioned about talking about cybercrime and cybersecurity is it is now one of the great existential threats we face as a society, and I'm going to help you with that discussion as well. So what is it? What is cybersecurity? Cybersecurity, if you strip it down, is three things. It's about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and systems. Simple. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and systems. If we understand that and we can educate boards, executives, and our customers, then we've done a good thing. So let me tell you why it's an existential threat and why the threat environment you, as people involved in the finance sector, is worse today than it was yesterday, and tomorrow will be worse again still. There are three drivers that make me come to that conclusion. The first is we have emboldened threat actors. I'm going to come back to each of these points. The first one is emboldened threat actors. The second is the technology surface we're trying to protect as institutions is in a state of increasing entropy. And the third is the consequences of inevitable failure are only getting higher. Let me briefly break down those 3 points. Threat actors. We can put them into 3 categories. The first is nation states, the second is criminals, and the third is insiders. Let me talk briefly about nation states. There's no doubt that most nation states would see cyber attack capabilities or cyber intelligence capabilities as being an important part of their national process. Australia is one of those countries. Unfortunately, you can divide the world into the rule of law countries and those that don't subscribe necessarily to the rule of law, and most of those, certainly the rule of international law, and most of those are one-party states. So we will see a range of nation-state threat actors that will interact with Australian government and corporate systems, and sometimes individuals' computers as well. Why? Because it's in their strategic interest to do so. If you run a financial institution today and you think that a nation state will not be interested in something that you do, I think you'd be wrong. Now, I'm going to say, however, criminals are the bigger threat for you, and we'll get to the criminals. But why would a nation state be interested in an Australian financial institution? It might just be because they've been told to collect as much information as possible on a particular country, in our case Australia, and so they will do that. And they, for their political masters, will gather as much information as they can. Sometimes I describe nation states and criminals as kleptomaniacs. They steal as much as they can and work out later if that information is useful. It might be because you bank someone that they are interested in. In the case of a nation like China, they might be interested in part of their diaspora. They might be interested in a pro-democracy activist. They might be interested in a Uyghur. There are a whole range of people that you might bank that are of interest to a nation like China, for example. So it would be wrong for us to think that nation states wouldn't be interested in gathering information, that concept of confidentiality. And it could well be that nation states prepare for conflict. It's unlikely that we will see nation states carrying out disruptive cyber activities that lead to shutting down of systems, this concept of the availability of our systems being impacted, but we have seen nation states do that. For example, the state of North Korea was responsible for the global WannaCry ransomware campaign of 2017, and the state of Russia was responsible for the NotPetya global ransomware campaign also of 2017. That was the Russians trying to impact the Ukrainians in a territorial dispute, which spilled over globally and was the most expensive crime in history, impacting financial organisations, critical infrastructure, and a whole range of other aspects of economies well outside of the Ukraine. So it can happen. However, criminals in particular are very interested in financial institutions. And that's logical, and you would expect that to be the case. So I won't labour much why criminals will be interested in the institutions that you run or work for. Most of the criminals we deal with in this space, in this particular part of cybercrime, are motivated by money, and quite logically, you have money that they will try to take. Criminals, unlike nation states, build harm into their business model. They actually monetize harm. And the types of crimes that we see today are ransomware, for example, which I'm going to get into, are a classic example of where harm is used to make money. Now, I mentioned that these threat actors are emboldened. And they're emboldened because we haven't driven cost into their operating model. And sadly, we've driven cost into our own, which is the wrong equation to have. So neither nation states nor criminals have many consequences for overreaching online. In the concept of state-based actors, naming and shaming has done very little to change behaviours, and there are very few international norms that we can push onto countries. When it comes to criminals, it is the vast bulk of those criminals that will be impacting an Australian financial institution are located offshore, and it is extremely unlikely that their activities will be investigated, even less likely that they will be arrested by law enforcement agencies, and even less likely still that they will receive any form of custodial sentence. And as a consequence, criminals, being quite rational, will move increasingly into a space where the chances of being caught are low and the rewards for activities are high. The third category of threat actor who are emboldened are insiders, trusted insiders. And my definition of trusted insiders is slightly broader than the one we've traditionally used when we talk about crime and investigations. I talk about trusted insiders being our staff or our supply chain, people that we trust to carry out work on our behalf for us. And they can be broken into a range of categories. Malicious insiders, people that want to do us harm, might be a disgruntled former employee who we haven't taken off a computer system, who can come in and cause some type of harm. It might be an employee who has a gambling habit or some other thing that drives their need for cash, and they will do harm to us as institutions. But the supply chain issue when it comes to cybersecurity is the big one that we have seen come to life quite dramatically in the last couple of years, when either nation states and or criminals have poisoned the supply chain technically, so whether it's software or hardware, or they've used trusted suppliers to become the Trojan horse through a weak back door, as I mix my analogies, into better protected systems. So insiders are really important for us to have a better understanding of. So they're the threat actors. In summary, they're emboldened and will likely increase in their adventurous activities. I mentioned that the tech surface that we protect has a state of increasing entropy. Let me explain that briefly. Many of you will be moving to the cloud. Many of you will have moved to more modern technologies, and that's a good thing because largely older systems have a greater threat surface because criminals and nation states have been able to spend more time trying to work out where the holes are in those systems. The trouble is, and what we see consistently in this industry, is that while we've moved some parts of our operations to more modern technologies, we've often left behind applications or other things that are important to us as a business, but were too expensive to move or were considered to be too time consuming, and we'll come back to it later and migrate this to a more modern technology. As a consequence, we've extended the surface we're trying to protect, and by adding things like BYOD, bring your own device, allowing employees and boards and others to log into systems, access documentation, conduct activities using their own technologies, adding the overlay of a COVID environment where we've been able to push a lot of workforces away from office environments into their own homes, has just extended this technology surface. As we add things like operational technology, and if you run ATM machines, I'm going to put that in the operational technology bucket. Other industries might be in manufacturing or in power generation, use an awful lot of these SCADA type systems, off-on type switches, none of which were designed to be exposed to the internet, all of which now are. When we add all of that together, we have this state of entropy. And what we see now is criminals and nation states finding more and more vulnerabilities in either old systems and sadly sometimes in our new systems, and the time we have as those that are trying to defend against those vulnerabilities and the weaponization of those vulnerabilities has dropped dramatically. In fact, it's now not uncommon and sadly therefore increasingly common for us to see really catastrophic vulnerabilities in technologies only on the day that these are being actively exploited. And often now, sadly, even more sadly, not until sometimes months, potentially years after people have been exploiting those technologies. What we also see now, which is a really interesting trend, is that when either a nation state or criminal is exposed for exploiting a vulnerability, we sometimes see within 24 hours a whole range of other criminal groups and nation states work out how to weaponize that vulnerability and pile in as well. Sometimes I refer to it as the United Nations of criminals who are now actively punching into our systems. So this concept of what we're trying to protect has only become harder even as we try to modernize. So if there's a leave behind for you there, it's to ask about the systems that we didn't think were important, that we have left operating because they seem to work as we look for our modern customer-facing systems to be uplifted into the cloud or other more modern forms of service delivery. Don't forget the long tail. In fact, in January of this year, we saw the Acelian data breach, the Acelian FTP data breach. The Acelian technology that was exploited by ransomware criminal groups in this instance was 20 years old and internet facing. So it worked. And I don't blame the organisations that had this 20-year-old piece of technology that was sitting on the internet doing its job. But we have to ask ourselves the question, is it wise to leave a 20-year-old piece of technology facing the internet? And that impacted a range of Australian and New Zealand organisations that we helped respond to the incident. But again, eminently defensible to have this stuff still sitting there doing work for us as in institutions, but also at the same time quite risky. And that leads me to my last point on these three levers. And that is the consequences of inevitable technology failure. And I use the word inevitable intentionally. It is inevitable that a nation state or a criminal or an insider will impact our technology. There is no such thing as a completely secure piece of connected technology. There is no such thing. And any organisation that sells you that, whether it's a vendor selling you a cybersecurity solution or a company coming in saying we can advise you on how to be completely secure, they are selling you a lie. They're selling you a lie because the name cybersecurity is wrong. This is a cyber risk question. Our job as organisations, whether those of us who come in and try to help secure you or you as a customer, is about risk, and it's about risk resilience. If we can make organisations more risk resilient, then we've done our jobs. We cannot make you secure. You cannot have connected technologies that are secure. So in the inevitable instance where that technology is exploited, as we rely more and more upon those technologies, which again is a very normal part of our society as we try to become more efficient, more tech savvy, have better data to do analytics for our customers, serve them better, less friction, less cost, more convenient for them. When that technology fails, the consequences increase. In the last 3 weeks, we've seen 2 examples of when the internet itself, through content delivery networks failing, first was as I say, 3 weeks ago, and the second was last week. It shut down websites, it shut down serious parts of our economy because of what was not cyber security incident, not crime, not a malicious state actor, but human errors that led to these critical pieces of technology on the internet failing. Shows the consequences of it. So the 3 levers again, as a takeaway, emboldened threat actors, a state of increasing entropy in the surface that we're trying to protect, and increasing consequences from inevitable failure of technology or exploitation of technology. Now, how does this relate to humans? The first thing I'd say is this. Threat actors, whether nation states or criminals, target us as end users. They target the human. We are the weak link, and that's not a bad thing, but it's the reality. So we will be sent spear phishing emails asking us to click on something, to upload something, or it could be a zero-click phishing email that literally will, in the right circumstances, unpack itself and start moving through an organisation. Now, there is a lot of psychology used by nation states and criminals as they go about the process. Whether it's a sense of urgency, hey, I need you to do this for me now, or it's from a person that we know and trust. All of these things are human in nature. And certainly there are technologies we can use, but we also need to understand human psychology as we do this. Where at a more macro level, our human nature leads to this increased problem is things like us as organisations wanting to make sure our technology is up 24/7. In a modern internet world, we expect our services to be 24/7. We expect them to always be there. And by doing that, by organisations demanding that uptime is more important than our risk resilience, it means we can't do simple things like patching our operating systems and patching our applications. Really important hygiene when it comes to our cyber risk resilience. But it's not uncommon in an organisation to say, I knew there were vulnerabilities, but I wasn't allowed to take my systems offline in order to patch them. And let me say this to anyone out there that will argue that a bank has to be up 24/7. The one way to guarantee you won't be is to not patch, because that is what gets exploited and weaponised by nation states and criminals. This concept of always on is one of the great failures of the internet age and is the human weakness that is exploited by the threat actors. Now, what's the what that we're seeing? The what that we're seeing in terms of financial institutions, and frankly many others, is ransomware, business email compromise, and unrelenting theft of personal and other data. So let me talk a little bit about those. If you haven't heard of ransomware yet, then you should. Ransomware is the concept of criminal groups locking up your computers and sending you a form of communication saying, pay up to unlock your systems. What we have seen in the last year is quite a dramatic shift of the way criminals are operating. And what they're doing in order to lock up your system, they have to be in your system. They're exfiltrating data first, then they're locking up systems, and they create a double bind for us as organisations. Because there's only one thing worse than me not being able to access my computers and serve my customers, and that is that the customer data has been stolen as well. And they will demand a ransom in exchange. The number one question I get asked by boards is, should I pay a ransom if it happens? And I'm sure James will ask me that question, so I'll try to work out a good answer for him. The second one we'll talk about, by the way, is business email compromise. And I think financial institutions will be increasingly in the frame for this. These are very simple emails that are sent by criminals who will break into a business. They'll repackage invoices with a different BSB and account number and go to the customer and say, you owe me however much money, please pay into my changed bank account. Now, the human aspect of this, very simply solved, is if I'm the recipient of an invoice and the banking details have changed of my supplier, I should phone that supplier up and say, hey, has your bank changed? And the reality is it's unlikely that it has changed, and they'll say no. Oh no, therefore it's fraudulent. I'll say to them, look, your computer system or mine must be compromised because the criminals know far too much about us, and we'll go about just paying. Why do I think banks will be increasingly in the frame? For two reasons. One, in order to take the cash out, the criminals require money mules to extract that cash, and far too often we see those money mules being successful in extracting the fraudulently obtained money out of an Australian bank. But the second more important reason is, for far too long, banks have said it is the customer who authorises that transaction. If they've clicked, I authorise it, then it's the customer's responsibility. I think we will see, and we have already started to see, people saying, but the financial institution knows more about fraud, knows more about the environment, knows likely that this other account that I'm transferring to has just been set up, and that the beneficiary name doesn't match that of the account. And so I think we will see more responsibility pushed onto financial institutions in a real-time way to stop fraud. Now, James is almost going to appear to start asking me questions, so let me just quickly talk about where I think we're heading. Now, you are the wonderful recipients of APRA's CPS 234. One of the more sort of, I'd say, exercised regulators when it comes to the concept of resilience, I will say to you, you will not be alone. The federal government has discovered its voice when it comes to cyber security and cyber resilience, and many other parts of the economy will have similar obligations as CPS 234. Via the SOCI Act, the Securing of Critical Infrastructure Act, we will see upwards of 13 sectors of the Australian economy be facing the consequence of understanding risk at a board level, at a much higher level of an organisation. That is a good thing. Notifiable data breach, I think we'll see privacy legislation increase over time to be more similar to the Europeans. And again, while that will cause cost, it's not a bad thing for us as businesses, and especially so for our customers. A few quick takeaways before James appears to get me back on track. We need to be careful not to spend too much time on compliance and the hygiene aspect versus the actual risk resilience. It is very important for you to be compliant in a regulatory environment. Having come from government and having been in, having run the entity that told government what it had to do in terms of compliance, it's very important that we don't get into a compliance mindset rather than a risk resilience mindset. Compliance is necessary, and it's an important muscle for us to then be able to go into this concept of risk management. The last thing is this: what do you need to do as organisations? One, start having a conversation about it. All humans have a role to play in fighting crime and improving our risk resilience when it comes to cybersecurity. We need to have board awareness. We need to have boards and C-suites exercising what happens, not if something goes wrong, but when something goes wrong. Make sure you plan for an incident. If you don't have the capability inside your company, find a good buddy to get on with and start practicing what to do when an incident happens. And the last thing is this: compliance is good. Real-time understanding of what's happening inside your network and with your customers is even more important. So with that, let me just say that even if you know nothing about cybersecurity or cybercrime, start having a conversation about it. Hopefully that last 25 or so minutes has helped. James and I think now are here to have a conversation.
Yes, that was fantastic. You stay there at the lectern, Alistair. That was really interesting. And we have a good amount of time for questions. So if you've got any or comments, just hit the Q&A tab, send them in. You don't want to wake up tomorrow morning and think, oh, I wish I'd asked the huge expert that. I'm not quite sure what to do. So ask it now. Well, let me start with the obvious one. Should I pay a ransom?
Oh, I knew I led with my chin there. Look, the former police officer in me, James, says no. You don't pay a terrorist, you don't pay a kidnapper.
Yeah.
I'm going to put a comma, but I'm not sure if that's the right English to use.
No,
we should never pay a criminal. Why? They're criminals, firstly. You can't trust them. By their nature, they are untrustworthy creatures. And there are many examples of when paying a criminal has not led to the decryption key to unlock our computer systems. And we have no certainty, even if you pay them, that of course, because you're dealing with criminals, that they'll destroy the data that they've stolen, that they're threatening to dump online to embarrass you. And
well, couldn't it even come back as an incentive to go again?
Of
Or
course.
they pay, we'll go with them again.
Right, so that's a broader question. Well, actually, it's very specific. You get on to a suckers list.
Yeah.
So scammers who scam, my dad has dementia, sadly, lovely guy, has dementia. Fraudsters have done him over a couple of times. And of course, what do? But they see a guy that they can defraud again. Ransomware threat actors are exactly the same. If they know you'll pay, they'll probably try to do you again. Having said that, there are times, and we know there are organisations who pay, and we help with that process. That where the consequences associated with the system being locked up or the data is so sensitive that the harm is going to be greater if that continues because you don't have backups, or there might be super sensitive health data or other such things where sadly the best course of action might be to pay the criminal, which sticks in my throat every time. So what I say to boards when they ask is, no, you shouldn't, comma, there is a defence at law, this concept of duress and harm, that we think makes it legal to do so. It's not been tested in Australian courts, by the way. It would be interesting when it does get tested. That there are times when paying may be the best course of action.
Yeah.
Of course, like all things, like any medical issue, the best the best course of action is prevention. Easier said than done. I've already said that every computer system can be hacked or harmed by a criminal or a nation state, but we can reduce the likelihood, and very importantly, we can reduce the harm associated when it does happen.
And one of the things you said was really important to reduce the likelihood of an attack is kind of a cultural change, a change of, you know, we need to stop the system to patch, we need to check everything that we're not 100% sure is completely fine. How do you start, particularly when people are racing against deadlines and under pressure and want to hit their targets, how do you bring in that cultural change? What are some specific things you can do?
Yeah, really fundamental question. So, you know, a lot of cybersecurity should be done by people who aren't the cybersecurity people, right? Everyone in an organisation needs to understand they've got a role to protect. Just like, for example, every bank officer who was at the front desk knew that they were probably the first line of against a fraudster or against someone else who was going to cause harm to the institution. The same care needs to be applied when it comes to our cybersecurity. So firstly, it's just knowing that you might be the vector of attack. And there's no shame in it, by the way. We've got to stop shaming victims. That's a really other huge topic, and we've not done well in this country.
Does that happen?
Oh yeah, we shame victims all the time, organisations. We should come to that. The second is, when we talk about our technical developers, we've got to build cybersecurity into the foundation of when we code and when we connect systems up. So it's not, I'm going to develop a system or write some software and then I'm going to throw it over the fence to a cybersecurity person to test it. We need to build that security in, this concept of DevSecOps, right? So it's you're a developer, you're developing things, but you've got security at the heart of what you do. It's like building a building here, the foundation's right, the building tends to stay up. Coming in afterwards and try to buttress that foundation is harder, more expensive and more time consuming. So you build security from the ground up, and you make sure that at a board level, and increasingly you're obliged to anyway, in the case of our financial institution friends, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority says they have to, at a board level, have these discussions, understand residual risk. So this concept of risk comes into regulation, and it means that you have this mindset that says, I'll prevent what I can prevent, I'll detect it quickly when risk is realised, and I act on it quickly again to reduce the harm. It's a bit like every other risk equation we have in life. Long answer to a question.
Yeah, no, that's good. But it also means, doesn't it, that anyone in the organisation, or at least anyone with an email account, has to understand that they have a role to play here.
Yeah, we all do. And look, even the home consumer can form part of criminal groups without even knowing. So if my home computer was compromised, criminals might store illegal tools, imagery or other things on it. They might use my computer as part of what we call a botnet, this concept of these denial of service attacks. Remember Census 2016, who could forget? Yeah. We're coming up to 5 years, by the way. Let's see how that goes. So, you know, an individual's computer can be part of, think about it also, my computer's compromised and my address book gets stolen, and then people get spammed using my email, and you're a trusted friend, and then you click on something and open it up, and so the contagion spreads. In many respects, this current COVID situation we're in is very similar to the cybersecurity issue we find ourselves in, and that is, for a long time we all thought we'll go to work with a cold because we'll soldier on. Remember the ads? I noticed they've changed, by the way, those ads, which is interesting. We won't name brands, of course. It's almost like we're on the ABC. But we all realise now that we've got a responsibility to get tested, to wear a mask, to do those other things, because I don't want to get sick myself, but more importantly, I don't want to harm others in the community. Yeah. Cybersecurity is exactly the same. If we take a pandemic view of it, we can actually all know the part we play, all recognise the fact that no individual action is going to be the solution, but if we collectively address it, we can actually get a handle on it.
You mentioned work from home and bring your own device. Two things now, particularly work from home, that's exploded since the pandemic. What are some specific ways that organisations can reduce the risk with both of those?
Yeah, well, weirdly, the work from home bit was actually quite a fascinating thing that happened. You know, depends on it's like any stat, you can pull one out. But some people say that in 3 months we accelerated by 3 years in terms of our IT modernisation. Some would say it's 5 or 10 years. In government, it's probably 100 years, right? I mean, delivering yesterday's technology tomorrow maybe is the sort of government IT model. No offence to my former government friends. But, so we suddenly lifted and shifted huge parts of the workforce in ways that we would have spent years debating how we would do it, and we've just done it overnight. So in some respects, by moving to the cloud and modernising, we've done a pretty good job. That's a good thing. Now we're using home routers and other things that are potentially vulnerable, which is the bad bit. This concept now, sometimes organisations either didn't have enough computers or there were just none on the shelves to be able to give people, so they were using home computers to do work, and that's always hard when we mix our pleasure with work, which sadly technology has made sure is just all through our life.
Yep.
And criminals could attack us through our home activities and tunnel through into the work bit, because every time we think we can segment a computer to our home bit and the work bit, someone proves that you can't, and they burrow through into the work bit, and then it becomes that track into the organisation. So I'm not a doom and gloom guy, but the more we mix that life balance thing, which we've done with COVID,
the higher the risk,
more of a threat surface. And by the way, criminals and nation states jump onto any crisis straight away. 2 years ago it was bushfires, and we all had a horrendous time, and every scammer in the world started doing a bushfire appeal or using a bushfire alert to inject malicious code into our systems or to extract money from us. Guess what happened with COVID? But nation states and criminals jumped on the back of COVID alerts and notifications to do exactly the same thing.
Tim asks, so nothing we can do if a disgruntled or compromised employee walks out the door with a loaded USB with data?
Well, thanks for asking, Tim. Yes, there are things you can do.
Yeah, good.
Right, well, let me try to answer it.
Search him before he leaves.
That's right. Well, it's really important. So we've got this concept of identity and access management and privileged access management. That means if James works in my broadcasting studio, James has certain rights of access with his computer, but he doesn't have access to all the back-end staff files at the ABC because that's not his job. He's not in HR or in the payroll section. If he's in the payroll section, he can do pay, but he can't necessarily, for example, change what's happening with the broadcast. This is this concept of segmentation, Tim, as you know, and so if we segment roles, we can at least reduce the likelihood of how much a person can steal. Right. Then there's this concept of monitoring what it is a person does online. Now, the reality is most of us don't have a lot of privacy when we're using a corporate system. We'll all acknowledge something that says, you acknowledge that your employer will monitor your systems and blah, blah, blah. A lot of them don't, but they'll still have the warning up. We need to do better at having those equivalent of CCTVs, cameras across our networks to better understand. Then it's things like disabling USB keys in your work computer. These days, it's unlikely you can just plug something into a laptop or a PC and have them work, because organisations have realised it's not only a great way to steal stuff, but it's a great way to inject malicious code into computers. And then it's making sure that when an employee leaves, Tim's disgruntled friend, that you take him off the system or her off the system straight away and do an audit of what they've done, and then go and sue them or tell the cops. So there are things you can do, but ultimately we have to trust our employees. So there's an interesting balance. You segment, you monitor, and sort of trust but verify. Trust but
verify, kind of trust. Another one, with fraud inevitable, is it best to maintain a cash-based ecosystem to ensure ongoing trading at all levels? Well, we all think cash is going the way of the dinosaur, don't we?
Right, yeah, well, I can't remember the last time I carried cash, and then you go to, you go to a place that still today will only accept cash. I went to a poker game, don't tell anyone, last Saturday back in Canberra, and I didn't turn up with cash. I didn't know, we were actually going to bet real money. I lost. It was only $50. I had to borrow it from the guy that won, so I told him he got his money back, which he did. But I didn't carry cash. Who carries cash these days?
No.
But you're right. Financial institutions need to make sure they can still serve their customers. So in all of that sort of disaster recovery planning and that resilience planning inside organisations, you've got to ask the what ifs. Now, you've heard of this concept of a black swan event. The black swan, no one thought there were such things as black swans. It's completely
incredibly
impossible.
Unlikely.
Then you discover them in Western Australia, right? And it's a black swan event. A critical cybersecurity incident is not a black swan event. We can predict it. We know it's going to occur. The only question is when. So if we know there is going to be a time when our computer systems are down, if we know there's a time when someone is going to cause us catastrophic harm, plan for it. Either have the cash reserves or have another financial institution that can carry out your business for you. In other countries, in Canada, for example, they had a bank teaming system where institutions would know each other's customer, sort of break glass provision, so they could serve a customer of another financial institution. This is my understanding. I'm not a banker, so let me put an asterisk on this. And they buddied up. So if Bank X fell over, go to Bank Y and you can still be banked. One other thing that you've reminded me of in my anarchist approach to this is I mentioned that it's about confidentiality, integrity and availability. I didn't talk about the integrity bit much. When I talk about existential threats, it's really the integrity bit that scares me most. So confidentiality, logically, someone steals information. Availability, someone locks up our systems. Bad, right? We know it's bad, but we know it's happened. What if I can't rely upon the integrity of the data to do my business decisioning? What happens if I actually can't, with hand on heart, verify how much money you've got in your bank account?
Right.
Or that you actually own property, so you're now the land titles office, and someone has come in and tinkered with records, and you can't prove, because that's the point of truth, right? Or my birth certificate is my point of truth as to my age and place of birth and who my parents were. What happens if that got changed? Not blocked, but changed. It's the integrity bit that scares me most. And that's a black swan, well, it's not a black swan event, again, I've already mentioned it. How do you plan for those things? Cash economy, make sure you've got access to some cash or a financial institution who can help you, is the way to deal with that question.
I reckon generally in modern society, we're okay at dealing with risk. Like most people have house insurance, car insurance, medical insurance. You fudge a bit and you bring your premium down and hope you don't get that or whatever. Would you say that companies generally with cyber have been hoping rather than hedging? That is, they've been hoping something won't occur rather than assuming it will and you know, managing that risk?
Yeah, well, there's a phrase, of course, that says hope is not a strategy.
Yeah.
I think we've all relied upon it every once in a while. As our strategy, you can't hope that cyber isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
You asked the question about insurance, or you mentioned insurance. In all of those sort of risk discussions, you've mentioned insurance. Now, we all know, and the institutions that are online today know, that cyber insurance is still a very nascent business. It hasn't developed as fast as many of us thought it would, but it will come. At the moment, a lot of policies got sold that were either too cheap and then they get cashed out, and the insurers and the reinsurers and all those other bits, that long tail of insurance has suffered a lot. So they're getting much more savvy in how they're going to price those insurance policies. And I suspect in time, organisations will just have to have a policy. Most of the financial institutions probably do, right? But the pricing of them and how they pay out is still, as I say, very nascent. That'll crystallise pretty quickly.
Do you have any guesstimate of how many Australian companies, what percentage would have that sort of insurance?
I'd say the vast bulk don't.
Yeah.
Now, I won't talk about the financial institutions in particular. I'd say if you just look at the size of the industry, you just conclude by the amount of cash that isn't going into insurance, that it's just not big. And that's because a lot of people are relying upon some type of general risk being realised policy. We've seen insurers not pay out for what was attributed to be a nation-state activity, saying, well, that's an act of war. So the Russian example I used in my speech was this concept of NotPetya. It was a global ransomware campaign. It was the most expensive crime in history. And you had insurers not paying out because they said, well, that's an act of war because it was a nation-state doing it. So there's a lot of stuff we've got to sort out with insurance. But insurance offsets some risk. It doesn't get rid of risk, right? So when I talk about risk, oh, sorry for hitting my microphone, everyone. When I talk about risk, that's one of the ways to look at it, but you really need to be looking at risk instead, in this case, of what risk can I control, what's the residual risk, what will happen when that risk gets realised, and how do I contain it? And then insurance is a nice to have, maybe pay for my incident response, maybe pay ransom or other things, but don't rely on insurance to stop the problem happening.
Yeah, fantastic.
Sorry for my ramble.
No, it's good. It's fantastic info. Do both sides of Parliament, Commonwealth Parliament, have the same view of how to defend Australia against cyber attacks, and I guess what the government should be doing? So
generally, what I'd say is on national security issues, and I've clearly worked in that space. the political parties are pretty aligned. So legislation of a national security nature goes in front of a thing called the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. I mentioned the SOCI Act changes, the Securing of Critical Infrastructure Act. That's currently before PJCIS. It's a Labor-Liberal thing, and they will make recommendations, and my understanding is they have made recommendations for some changes that are bipartisan in nature back to the Department of Home Affairs Minister, Karen Andrews, and she'll consider those and put it before Parliament. Recently, Tim Watts, the opposition cybersecurity minister, and there is no government cybersecurity minister. For any government folk out there, I'd say it's a good thing.
There should be one.
I worked to a couple of them, and they don't have one anymore. You know, the Home Affairs Minister and the Defence Minister are the two sort of dominant ministers when it comes to cybersecurity in the government. The opposition cybersecurity spokesperson has just introduced some legislation to Parliament, a private member's bill talking about ransomware, and not banning ransomware payments, but saying that there should be a system where you must contact the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and tell them the telltale signs of the way the criminality works. How are they communicating with you? What IP addresses? What infrastructure are they using?
Do you agree with that?
Well, look, I think it's a good thing for us to increase the transparency of what's actually happening with crime. So here's the thing. I've spent 20 years dealing with cybercrime. It's really tough because you don't have the stats, right? And you know, lies and statistics. But if people have no need or obligation to report it to you, and the reason why people don't report cybercrime is they don't expect the police to do anything. Yeah. And that's sad. If it was any other crime, first people you call are the cops, right? In fact, the insurers will demand you call the cops before you can make a claim. We have no such transparency about criminality. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, the government really doesn't necessarily want to know how big this crime type is, because then you've got to do something about it, and that's sad. And you know, that's the closest I'll get to criticism. Law enforcement agencies are not scaling to this nor understand the threat as much as they need to. If this was any other type of crime, you know, Tim Watts said yesterday, and again, I'm not being party political here, I've worked usually for Liberal Party people, if these were outlaw motorcycle gangs that were doing this type of stuff, you wouldn't be launching an education campaign to fight it, right? You're not going to try to educate people out of bikies. You'd do some strong arm law enforcement action, and society would expect that. I think the same has to happen with online crime. And then,
but aren't most of the criminals offshore?
They are, but that doesn't mean police can't act. I mean, I was in the Australian Federal Police. All drugs come from offshore. The vast bulk of drugs come from offshore. So what would the AFP do? They would post people to drug production countries. They would post people to drug transshipment countries. They would look at money laundering and other such things. So you'd look at choke points and you look to apply pressure. They would work with law enforcement agencies in those countries to arrest or to extradite people. So this is just crime.
Yeah.
Crime using technology, and they tend to do it from countries where the rule of law is not so great, very similar to drugs. Now, I just want to get back onto this concept of victimisation, which is this other thing. As a country, we are very, very bad at learning from crime because we tend to re-victimise the victim. Right. In offline crime, we've learnt to stop. Magistrates and detectives, hopefully, don't ask the question anymore about why were you in that bar? Why were you wearing what you were wearing? Why were you walking down that street in order to be victimised? Thank God we've learnt as a society not to do that anymore with offline crime, largely. Online crime, the first question asked of a victim organisation is, how did you allow yourself to be attacked by criminals? Right. No one asks a bank why they were robbed by a person carrying a shotgun. Everyone feels sympathy for the bank and hates the crook. Yeah. When it comes to online crime, we blame the victim first. You were stupid enough to fall victim to a scam, to an advance fee fraudster, a Nigerian prince, or a lottery winning scam. You were stupid enough to allow ransomware to come onto your systems. We've got to get rid of this victimisation and instead take an airline industry type view. And you remember the airlines and the manufacturers of aircraft. If there was an incident in one place, then you would transmit it to everyone and say, we just found a fault with an engine. And you should all make sure that engine doesn't have that same fault so the plane doesn't fall out of the air. Now, there have been some catastrophic examples where that hasn't happened lately, of course, but generally speaking, that's the right attitude. So we need to learn from near misses and actual events, communicate that with everyone else so that they can fix the same problem to stop the crooks. We should be pushing cost into them, not us. We've got 47 seconds. Got a quick question?
Last question, yes.
Yes, sir.
If a board wants to educate their people about being more aware and preventing cybercrime, should they design a program themselves? Can they get one from somewhere?
Yeah, look, like if they're a big enough institution, clearly you're going to have enough of your own IT security staff, cybersecurity staff to do it. If not, find yourself someone who can come in and work with the board and the executive about these things. It's just logical. Exercise that muscle. I guarantee you this. A friend of mine who used to run sort of crisis nationally, bushfires and things, he said it's called a crisis for a reason. It's because it doesn't go to plan. So you can exercise for it, and I guarantee you whatever you exercise for isn't what happens, but you develop the muscle and the skills to be able to cope with the crisis. That's what we've got to do.
Yeah, it's like with COVID. First lockdown, everyone's freaking out. Now it's like, here we go again, but we know what to do.
Yep, manage it.
That was fantastic, Alistair. Thank you very much. Really great.